Dr. Nadine Burke, it is such an honor and a pleasure to have you with us in this summit. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my joy to speak with you today.
Wonderful. So there's so many things for us to explore, but I thought because this is a mindfulness summit, we'd first kind of begin to explore that area, because I know that's something that as you began to look at wellness and at healing, that was a really important component that you've been talking about in your work. And I'm wondering how mindfulness kind of became an interest in your world. Was it something you were interested in very young, or did you read some research, or did you notice your life is going kind of crazy and you needed more presence and more mindfulness in your life? How did that particular area kind of come into your radar, if you will?
So for me, it really did come from reading the research. I was working in a clinic in a very low income neighborhood of San Francisco, and I was caring for a lot of patients who experienced a lot of stress and trauma and adversity. And I was interested not just in cataloging what was going on with them, but really understanding what interventions might be healing. And so in looking at the research on stress physiology, activation, all of that kind of stuff was where I learned about mindfulness as an intervention to help to regulate the stress response. And then that turned out to be really helpful because my job is really stressful. So I actually ended up, as I incorporated, more research, and I actually incorporated mindfulness into my practice as a pediatrician. Then in finding experts who could do it and bringing it to my clinic, I actually did it with my patients, and that was my first experience with mindfulness.
Wow, so you took actually a workshop or a seminar with your patients, with a teacher or an instructor?
Yeah, we actually did. We actually did a clinical intervention where we brought, it was some of our young women who had experienced significant adverse childhood experiences together, and we brought in a group called the MBA project. It was the Mindfulness-Based Awareness Project in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we paired a mindfulness instructor with me as the pediatrician, talking about how stress affects our bodies physically. And we did this, amazing session with these young women in really working through really building tools for them on how they could use mindfulness to calm their physiology and hopefully improve their health.
Wonderful. And what are some of the ways that you found personally for yourself? I know there's many, many different doorways to things that kind of help us kind of feel more calm and at ease and grounded and centered and mindful. What are some of the ways that I know you have 4 kids, you have a very busy job.
Yes.
What are some of the ways that you found in a day kind of help you cultivate that feeling of presence and awareness?
Yeah, so that piece is really interesting. For me, I did come to it and learn about it through, my professional capacity. But, there's a little bit of physician heal thyself in there, because my own experience was that my mindfulness practice became so important to me for my own day-to-day well-being. I feel like you know how it is, like you can feel the difference especially when you're practicing regularly. And for me, so much so that I, invited my husband to get trained and our kids to get trained, like all of these pieces. But for me, where it has been, where I think it was both incredibly usweFul for my patients and then also useful for me personally, is in this recognition that when we're looking at interventions, mindfulness is kind of this thing that we can carry with us, right? Like it's something that you can do any anywhere you are, any time of day, middle of the night, you wake up, you're having trouble sleeping, whatever it is, you're in a meeting. And even, you know, like for me as a mom, I'm with my kids and having, helping them to, you know, have awareness and pay attention to their breath and all of those things. It doesn't have to be like sitting cross-legged on a mountain. Like there's a million different ways that you can incorporate it into the day. And that's really what it's been for me. It's been just, you know, just a part of my regular wellness routine.
Great, thanks. I was looking at something that asked people about what made a good doctor to them, and they had a very list of things. And I remember one of the top ones on the list was that the doctor actually is present with the patient. You know, and I feel like there's something so powerful about that. I see you, I hear you, I'm not doing 10 other things while you're telling me your pain or while you're telling me your story. And I feel like you've really helped show that, like, in that there's a healing relationship that can potentially exist, whether I'm the doctor and you're the patient, or whatever the relationship is, when you feel seen and heard and you show up. And I feel like that's something that I've learned a lot from you.
Yeah. So, you know, Soren, when one of the things that I mentioned at the Wisdom Conference is that the hardest part of my job is being present with other people's suffering and not looking away, right? And not running away from it, and being present long enough so that I can be helpful, right? So that I can do something about it. And for me, mindfulness has really helped to enable me to be able to be present for some really hard stuff, right? Without compromising my self-care, right? Without then taking it on myself, like being able to be with it, but then also just, you know, at the same time, being able to, you know, nourish myself and still be well, right? And so that has been important.
Yeah, that's dance, isn't it? Where you can hear another suffering and you don't immediately feel like you have to fix it instantly, which I tend to do, where I feel like, oh, I've got to try and fix this person. And while there can be an intervention that might be needed, it's also, there's a bigger space, I think, of being able to be with and to hold that space for people.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the most powerful, you know, qualities we can learn as a parent, as a partner, as a physician. And I'm also feeling like we're trying to learn that as a society now, that there's a lot of pain and trauma that's been experienced historically through the US that largely, at least the white population, have not necessarily taken the time to bear witness to. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on kind of the healing of America and ways at which we can kind of skillfully begin to navigate some of the pain and the trauma that has been going on for generations, but that a certain aspect of the community or of our nation hasn't quite taken the time to really see and witness and hear. And what are some steps that we can begin to do that help support that? And I know that's a really big question, and I don't expect you to have the whole answer, but it feels like there's something important going on in the culture right now around trauma and around understanding trauma. And I wondered if you could share whatever thoughts you have about that.
Yeah. I think that for all of us who watched the George Floyd video, or even if folks didn't watch it, but, you know, heard about it or read about it, I will say for myself, and I think for most of the folks that I've talked to, that's vicarious trauma right there. Just witnessing the killing of a man in that way. And I think that for a lot of people, it is, it goes back to what we just talked about the ability to witness that, to be with that, right? And to understand that and recognize that is going on. And I think there's still one of the things that we are seeing in the U.S. is that there are many people who are having a very hard time with being able to acknowledge that, right? But if we don't acknowledge it, we can't heal. I think one of the things that I'm experiencing as a Black person, and I kind of chuckle about it, but it's like, especially I think within my own household, because my husband is Caucasian, we have these deep conversations all the time. But, you know, there's a way in which Black people, people of color, have known for a very long time that this is what's happening. This has been our experience. And I think there's many ways in which we recognize that, you know, depending on, you know, what our external appearances are, people live in different, like we live in different countries. We have different experiences. We have different realities. And I think that the thing about that we're seeing right now is that things like the invention of a video camera in every single person's cell phone, right? Like in everyone's purse, is that we don't have any plausible denial anymore. And so I think a lot of us are really reckoning. A lot of people are reckoning with what it feels like to have that be presented in a way that's really undeniable. And I think that's what feels so powerful about that video and about Mr. Floyd's death. And it's painful, right? It's traumatic. But we will never be able to move towards healing if we don't see it and recognize it and feel it. And so as we are seeing it and feeling it and experiencing it as intolerable, right? We also have to recognize that this is long work, right? Like, I think many of us are kind of like, hey, when, you know, we see this, we recognize it, and, you know, when is this going to be done? When is this going to be solved? And, you know, and I think that self-care is also really, really important for us to be able to be in this work for as long as it's going to take, right? For us to make meaningful change, which I think is possible. I'm very excited about where we are.
It does feel like there's a phrase where it's like, if you want to escape from prison, the first thing you must realize is that you're in prison. Before then, no escape is possible. And it feels like we might not know the path through, right? But there's an understanding more, you know, because we're all home and because we can't be distracted as much, maybe, of the pain and the trauma that's just kind of a part, and maybe it's a part of every nation, but it's definitely part of the United States history. And I'm curious, kind of like, how do what would you say? So there's a step of bearing witness, right? And saying this is reality. Like when I saw George Floyd's situation, like I cannot imagine that never even crossed my mind that would happen to me. Like I drive around and if I see a cop, never in my mind that cop would come and do anything harmful to me. And I know, because I worked in juvenile halls in New York City for years, that the kids have a totally different worldview, you know, of that. And so I feel like there's this great opportunity to kind of be able to understand each other's worlds. And understand the collective trauma that maybe has been experienced both individually, but also as a group. And I'm curious, like, I would love to hear, like, what gives you hope? Is your hope in the goodness of people? Is your hope in seeing so many people able to heal from trauma? But what is it that gives you hope when the situation might seem a little bit like, wow, we have so much work still to do?
Oh, there are so many things that give me hope. So a couple of things. Number one, looking at the younger generation as just the degree to which so many young folks are so deeply engaged in social justice initiatives, that is incredibly hopeful to me. I think the other thing that gives me hope is just to see how for example, how engaged people are. The fact that it wasn't a week of protests, right? That has continued and persisted, and folks have continued to haven't let up, right? And that, in fact, coalitions seem to be growing. But to be honest, for me, it's not about hope. Someone asked me that if I was hopeful, and I am hopeful, but it doesn't matter. For me, it's not, what drives me is not that sense of hopefulness. It's like, I don't have a choice. I am going to put down my head and do this work until it is done. Like, it's not about hopefulness. Like, we're just gonna, I feel like I don't have a choice in my life other than to continue to do this work in a really deep way. And I hope that we change outcomes, and I hope that we completely change the system. But regardless, this is the work that I'm committed to,
Yeah. And your commitment is to that, when you say those work, how would you define what that commitment is? Is it to the healing of trauma and the understanding of the impact on children? Or how would you describe that kind of deep, almost like
commitment? I think it is to the healing of trauma. And I think that I think that for me, the profound role that racial injustice has in creating this trauma and the impact that it has on our brains and bodies and on our health has always been implicit. But now that piece feels much more explicit, and it feels like it's much more explicitly understood. And so, that would be the piece.
And I'm wondering, because a lot of people are facing a lot of stress now, there's the stress of walking into a grocery store and being worried that you're going to get COVID, or seeing somebody on the street. And I notice my body all of a sudden can go into like fight or flight mode, and bumping into somebody, in a store. And then there's also the stress of the economy. What are some practices? What are some perspectives? What are some kind of ways that you feel like we could, as a society, begin to kind of help us address some of the stress that many people are feeling now, and what's clearly an unprecedented time in our nation with COVID-19?
Yeah, one of the things that I like to tell people is that if it feels hard, it's because it is hard. We are in a once in a century pandemic. We're also in a once in 75 years economic downturn, recession, and a once in a half century level of civil unrest in reaction to racial oppression. So if it feels like a lot, it's because it's a lot. And I think that what we also recognize is that the hard thing, the additional difficulty of the pandemic, right, is that a lot of the social connections that we would rely on that are healing, right, that make such a difference, we're not able to access in the same way as we have before. You're not able to just go over to your BFF's house and hug it out and then go about your business, right? Like, and so I think that makes it more difficult. And some of the things that we actually did, that my office did, was we actually created the Surgeon General's playbook for stress relief during COVID-19.
Awesome.
Yes, so it's available on at covid19.ca.gov. And we really just took a lot of the research about things like mindfulness and exercise and sleep, having good sleep hygiene, and the importance of social connectedness, even if it isn't in person, but by phone, or checking in, by text, or doing that Friday night cocktail and Zoom, right? I don't want to encourage use of substances, but those things that they make such a difference, and really having that awareness of tuning in to see how we're doing, and also recognizing, in the same way that I think many parents are recognizing that when their kids are doing distance learning and they're trying to work, they're not going to be as productive, right? So we have to adjust our expectations about what we're going to accomplish right now. I think similarly, we have to recognize that with all that's going on, we have to be aware and kind of tune in that, yeah, this is going to affect me, and not only be, extra thoughtful about putting those supports into place. And this is why, I think right now, mindfulness, for me, my mindfulness practice is more important than ever. And I definitely feel the difference in my body when I'm like, oh, I've been so busy, I've been so crazed, and I haven't done my practice, and then getting back into it and feeling like, oh, and having those, I think this is where I really feel like, especially mindfulness as a self-care intervention right now, is so important, because it's so accessible to us right now, wherever we are at any time. But recognizing whatever those self-care practices that are most effective for someone. For some people it's art, for some people it's music, exercise is so important. Like all of these things, just really, ramping up that self-care routine, I think, is so important.
It's interesting, you didn't use the word compassion, but I kept thinking compassion when you were talking about just understanding. Of course, we're all going to be not at our best necessarily when you take away friends, when you take away social connections, when you add all the things that you mentioned in. And in my mind, I was hearing self-compassion, which I know is kind of, not everybody resonates with that word or that phrase, but just that level of kind of being able to be easy with ourselves, or to be kind of kind to ourselves. And to me, that feels like part of what we're all, the more difficult the time is, it's almost like the more kind we need to learn to be, and not just with others, but with ourselves, right? Like,
yeah, that's exactly right.
I'm going to do better next time, but just that level of kindness. And can our country in hard times, do we fight against each other, or do we come together? And I think, that's that question, like, do we stand together? Or do we stand apart? And as you were talking, I just kept thinking of the word compassion, what it means.
And yeah, I feel like that's how we manifest the future, right? Because there's part of the challenge right now also is that there's so much uncertainty, right? Which is extremely anxiety provoking. And interestingly, this question of, do we stand together or do we stand apart? I mean, whether we're talking about COVID response and trying to beat this pandemic and get through it as quickly as possible and move towards, economic and social recovery, it's all about standing together. It's all about everyone really, doing their part in terms of, I'm going to wear that mask. I'm going to social, have physical distancing. I'm going to, stay home to the extent that I don't need to be going out for non-essential things. And it's in many ways this question of our ability to stand together, right, is an existential one, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely, and it has a I don't like to use the word spiritual always, but it has a different dimension, right? Of like, we're together as people, and whether you label me this or a Democrat or Republican or whatever, we're also one people too. Like, all that is true.
It's fascinating. I think particularly a pandemic really reveals that very starkly, because it's global, and what we do so much depends on everyone's efforts, literally, like as a human race, like across the globe. So that's,
you can get it. There's no safety, right?
yeah.
Or it treats everybody the same, in if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to give you a chance too to speak, because I know you have some initiatives going on with the state of California around kind of really being able to identify trauma and helping support pediatricians in identifying trauma, and would love to hear how that's going and any other updates around that.
Yeah, so honestly, I feel like it could not have been more timely. It's kind of bizarrely coincidental that we launched the ACEs Aware initiative in California on January 1st of 2020. And the initiative was focused on training primary care clinicians. So, doctors, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, and not just those who are caring for kids, but also those caring for adults as well, to screen for adverse childhood experiences and other risk factors for toxic stress, and respond with trauma-informed care. Right. And I remember when I came into this role, I was sworn in February of 2019. And I had in my mind the plans for this initiative. And here in California, we identified about 45,000, a little over 45,000 primary care clinicians that would be the target of this initiative to try and train them. And I remember thinking, gosh, if I can even get a small percentage, right? If I can even get, 10% of that, right? That would be, almost 5,000 primary care clinicians who were screening, and over, all the patients that they see, that's going to be a lot of patients. And I'm really pleased to say, and I will say, so we have not only a really evidence-based curriculum and training, but for once, this is not an unfunded mandate. Not only are we doing the education to train providers how to screen, but they also get reimbursement for screening their patients. So they get, so this is a big deal. And I'm really, really pleased that for this initiative that is voluntary, we've already, in the past 6 months, trained over 12,500 primary care providers, pediatricians, adult medicine, OBGYN, family medicine, so that I did like a back of the envelope calculation of what that meant in terms of the number of patients who would get access to a provider who was trained on screening and trained on trauma-informed care. And it was like, somewhere around 10 million patients. That's like, don't quote me on that. That was just my quick back of the envelope, but it's a big deal.
It's a huge deal. It's a huge deal. Wow. There's a lot of questions I want to ask you, but I wonder if we could step back. How did you know this was yours to take on? Because there was probably a moment. I know there was a story of kids who you were seeing when you're working in the clinic, but there's a lot of people who've seen kids working in clinics. Something in you was like, this is mine to take on. And I'm wondering,
sorry, go ahead, finish what you were saying.
Well, I'm curious, do you remember that moment and how you accessed that, or how you trusted that? Because I feel like a lot of people are also kind of looking at life and they're wondering, where do I find that thing that I would pay money to do? So.
This is something that I described in my book, The Deepest Well. There was a moment, because I read the research and I was caring for my patients and I was doing the work in my clinic and I was screening and responding in my clinic. But I really thought, here I am, I'm this one little pediatrician. And so I see this and I've read the research and I think it's incredibly powerful. So I'm going to tell the powers that be, right? And they're going to fix it. And I had this opportunity to present the information to all of the hospital CEOs of all the hospitals in San Francisco. And I, presented to them, and I kind of said, what are you going to do about it? And they looked at me and said, well, we think it's very compelling. And then they turned around and said, Nadine, what are you going to do about it? And I remember in that moment feeling what felt like a gulf. It felt like a huge distance between where we were, because I thought they were going to solve it. And it was clear that they didn't have any solutions. And I was walking out of that meeting, and the woman who had been pouring the coffee followed me out to the elevator. And she said, I just want to tell you, I have 10 out of 10 of those ACEs that you were talking about. And that's me. That's been my life. I have struggled with my health. I have struggled with my mental health. I have struggled to stay sober. And she said, I just have to tell you, keep doing what you're doing. Wow. And for me in that moment, it really was a shift. Like,
universe was sending a messenger down to we are going to make sure you get this.
For real. It was like, okay, so if there are not, if I went to the powers that be and the powers that be don't have an answer, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to find an answer. And then we're going to move, and I'm going to keep pushing until those answers are available to everyone.
And do you have thoughts? I know this is a bit, but do you have thoughts on people who feel like there's that void in their life right now? They don't have that sense that they're contributing in a meaningful way. They don't have that sense of like, oh, this is mine to take on. Like, let me put my life force, my intelligence, my energy to kind of make a dent in the universe this way. And I think a lot of people now with COVID-19 are also just kind of questioning, like maybe they're getting a break from their job and they realize, I didn't actually like my job that much anyways, or I just want to I want to contribute. There's climate change, there's racial unrest, like I want to contribute in a meaningful way. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts for people who are kind of in that exploration of wanting to impact and not quite sure where to find the right guidance.
Yeah, I mean,
waiting for the woman at the coffee table to come tell them.
So the couple of things I would say about that, number one, is a recognition. Like, I'm incredibly fortunate that my life's passion, in terms of addressing trauma, happens to also coincide with my life's passion in terms of science and research and advocacy and all of that kind of stuff. And the fact that all of those things are things that our society values, right? So when I say I do this, people are like, oh, that's wonderful, right? But I think that for the person who gets that joy or that connection, whether it's through their art or through their music or through math, right? Or through, I swear my 8-year-old son is going to solve all the world's problems with Legos, right? But it's part of it, number one, is about letting go of the self-judgment or the preconceived notions about what that looks like, and recognition that it's so possible for us to heal the world in all of these, in little ways, right?
The woman, variety of forms, variety of shapes and forms.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Because the woman who was pouring the coffee that day, she changed my life. Like, she changed my trajectory. And I hope that she, one day comes to realize it. But I think those pieces in terms of it can be, there are a million kind of big and small ways. It can sometimes feel like we have to be doing something gigantic, and it can be just having compassion for another person, right? Yeah. Or for ourselves. It can be just being kind to someone in the supermarket, or showing up to a protest, or we're in our job, and maybe we're not that passionate about the work, but maybe we get really passionate about the fact around, you know what, I'm going to look at my workplace policies, and I'm going to be part of a committee that looks at how my place of work can implement anti-racist policies and practices. Right? Like, and it can be from big to little. It can be in the way that we,
Good to know that it might not, whatever story we have, that it's only exists in starting your own nonprofit, or only exists in creating some new foundation, that it's more multidimensional.
That's right.
Yeah. This is so good. Is there anything else that we did not address that you would love to address?
There's nothing I can think of. This has been just such a fun conversation.
Good. Well, I'm happy to have them anytime. And I love the science part of you, that I feel like that's such a deep in the data. And then I see these different parts. I also just really admire the compassion, kindness part of you, right? That's like, you just do it because it's what's right. And then the science part, which is like, here's actually the science to tell us how best to do it right. And so it's really an honor to be with somebody who kind of has so many different parts that you seem to integrate really well, right? Like you seem to, at least from my perspective, kind of welcome all of it. Like, I have space for the intuitive, I have space for the scientific, I have space for this. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that comes from, the thing about me is kind of like, what you see is what you get. It really is. I'm a total science nerd, and I completely love that. And then I also feel like, to your point, and to some of the things that we were talking about before, I think that acting with purpose and living with purpose is also healing. I think that for a lot of the things that we are experiencing nowadays, and sometimes particularly it feels like the challenges that we're facing right now, they feel intractable almost, right? And it's the question of like, how are we going to do here? And there's a way in which, for me, just living every day as in a way that feels really purposeful, that's a very, very important part of my well-being.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And it's almost its own type of medicine, if you will, right?
It is.
It gives life, or it gives us something. We're giving, but we're getting in the same way.
Yeah.
And that's the world that I want to support. I feel like a life, when I imagine a healthy society, I imagine they eat good food, they exercise, but they're also inspired and energized by the whole, and by, going from a me to a we, thinking and contributing in that way. And to me, that's such a compelling vision of what a healthy society looks like, as much as all the supplements and the foods and the things, they have their place, but like, you can't also put a price on purpose.
Well, thank you for helping to create that, right? That is what you do so well.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Harris, and it's just been a pleasure to have you.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.